Big, surprising, and welcome news on gun legislation today as I speak to you, and a trial in Philadelphia that could be the beginning of the end of football as we know it. But first, the most shocking piece of news today is this seemingly innocuous document. A simple, sterile page, a printout of a spreadsheet with numbers. Boring. But what the numbers represent is a massive nationwide crime scene. No, I mean that. That document is a summary of widespread and systemic error, malfeasance, and reckless lack of care on the part of our nation's biggest banks. What those numbers show are banks foreclosing on military service members who were entitled to relief, of banks foreclosing on homeowners who had been approved for a loan modification, of banks even foreclosing on homeowners who were not behind in their payments, not in default, current. In fact, amazingly, on that sheet of paper is the number 53, which denotes there are at least 53 documented cases of homeowners who were completely current on their payments being successfully foreclosed on. Not just having foreclosure proceedings initiated against them, but these are people who are making their payments, paying their mortgage, and actually have their homes taken from them for no reason. According to the findings posted just today by a federal bank regulator as part of a settlement agreement with a number of major banks, between 2009 and 2010, foreclosure proceedings that were wrongful or in some way contained bank error commenced against nearly 4 million homeowners. About 30% of foreclosures those being foreclosed on had to battle potentially wrongful efforts to seize their homes. 30%. More than 244,000 eventually lost their homes. Today, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, the regulator who compiled these statistics and came to its settlement with the banks, it was supposed to be announcing good news. It was supposed to be announcing money to those who have been victimized by the bank's practices. But given the scale of the deception and error, the amount of money on the table for those who've been victimized is in most instances cartoonishly small. A pittance compared to the billions of dollars about a dozen banks and their affiliates likely saved by getting this settlement deal. For example, there's the category of homeowners who were foreclosed on, that is, successfully kicked out of their homes, even though the borrowers had worked out a new payment plan with their bank to stay in their home, and they'd stuck to it. There are 234,000 of them. Another 865,000 were in the process of foreclosure, even though they too had gone to the bank and worked out a new payment plan. That, by the way, is euphemistically known as dual tracking, where a bank is processing your loan modification while also simultaneously pursuing foreclosure against you. A better term would simply call it double dealing or double crossing. So the 1,099,000 victims of dual tracking get $500 each. $500. It's a number so hilariously low, it has spawned Alexis Goldstein's What You Can Buy for Having Your House Stolen. One of her suggestions, this 2-meter dome for those homeowners lucky enough to get $5,000 from the settlement. Which brings us to our next notable category, homeowners in which the servicer initiated or completed foreclosure on a borrower who was not in default. If the foreclosure was completed on a homeowner who was not in default, $125,000. Now, $125,000, that is a lot of money. But that's $125,000 for taking your home away from you without any justification. These are people who did nothing wrong. They were not in default. They were current on their payments, and their homes were taken. In any other context, we would say they were stolen. They'll get $125,000 for their trouble. The outrage of that category matched perhaps only by this one. Servicer foreclosed on borrower eligible for Service Members Civil Relief Act. Translation: wrongfully foreclosing on active duty members of the armed forces. It's a criminal felony. The banks merely pay out $125,000 to those victims. All the other awards in all the other categories pay out mostly nominal amounts. Many of the 3.5 million homeowners who received some kind of payment were supposed to get an independent review from the government. But the Federal Reserve and the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, or OCC, punted. They punted because this independent review process to look into a system that was so deeply flawed and messed up that everyone around the country was scratching their heads, this deeply flawed system, as the New York Times characterized it. Instead, the OCC engineered a mass settlement. They got halfway through it and they said, you know what? No. Let's come to the table. What should the banks pay? And that is represented by this document. What it represents is, in any intuitive sense, the evidence of a crime wave that once again the banks will not have to answer for. Joining us from Sacramento, California is Faith Bautista, who is the victim herself of a wrongful home foreclosure in 2009. At the table, Eliot Spitzer, former New York governor and attorney general, and Alexis Goldstein, former vice president at Merrill Lynch and Deutsche Bank, now an Occupy Wall Street activist. It's great to have you here. Faith, I want to begin with you as someone who, if my understanding is correct, would qualify for the terms of this settlement. As someone who is wrongfully foreclosed on, what is your reaction to this big news today about what this settlement looks like?
Well, as a victim, I'm happy to receive something because I have applied since January of last year, and it's now April. I haven't gotten anything. And if I waited for their system without OCC unplugging the plug, I probably would not get anything. So to me, whatever I would get, I will be very happy. But I'm hoping I will get more than $500.
Are you looking at $500? Is that what you're looking at for being foreclosed on incorrectly, wrongly?
You know, at that time in 2009, I was with the World Savings, and I have a pick-a-pay type of payment, and I lost my job, so I can only pay the minimum, and then after a while, I really cannot pay, so I have like $12,000 in arrears. I asked World Savings, which is now U.S. Bank, to help me with the loan modification. In 2009, there was no program, so I was wrongfully foreclosed because for $12,000 in arrears, put 20% down on my house. Always been a great borrower since 1986.
Yeah.
To take my house away, you know how devastating that was, being a single mom and having 2 kids and being taken my house away. That's pretty sad. So if I need to get more than $500.
Alexis, how did we get there? How did we get here, right? So there's we have the housing bubble. Okay, the housing bubble, everybody goes out and they get mortgages, and then the mortgages all blow up, and the blow up makes the financial crisis. And what blowing up looks like on the backside is that banks are foreclosing left and right. And they're foreclosing on so many properties, they cannot deal with how many properties they have to foreclose on. And then what happens?
So the OCC, which is one of the bank regulators that used to be responsible for what's called mortgage servicing, which is just getting your monthly payments and giving you a loan modification if you need one.
So I have a mortgage, and there's someone I send a check to every month, right?
That's your servicer.
That's my servicer, okay.
Right, so the OCC is in charge of regulating them. They look really bad because there are all these people being wrongfully foreclosed on. There was the robo-signing scandal where the banks were fraudulently filling in documents. So they're like, what can we do to make ourselves look better? What can we do to make the banks look better? And what can we do to restore faith to the mortgage markets, which was one of the stated goals of this thing called the Independent Foreclosure Review that we've just seen the settlement for. So
there's all this news that sweeps the country. This robo-signing scandal is a huge thing, right? And it turns out the banks are saying, we're foreclosing on you. And when you say to them, wait a second, you're foreclosing on me. Do you have the documents to foreclose on me? They say, yes, this document right here. And that document right there isn't the actual document you need. In fact, it's an affidavit that's been signed by a robot or by someone they've been paying minimum wage to just sign documents saying, oh yeah, don't worry about it, we have it, right? Huge scandal, blew everything up, was in the Wall Street Journal, and everybody looks embarrassed. So the OCC says, okay, we're going to conduct a review.
Right, so they do this in April 2011, just a few months before the CFPB comes on board. The CFPB would have done this if they had just waited.
Okay, alphabet soup. The CFPB is the new Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which is part of the Dodd-Frank legislation passed by President Obama and by the Democrats with a little bit of Republican House in the House.
So one could argue that the OCC, the Office of Comptroller for the Currency, did this because they didn't want the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau under Elizabeth Warren to be in charge of this, because they have been known to be very kind to the banks, they have been known to bury the banks' bodies, and they have been known to lie on behalf of the banks, which they did in this independent foreclosure review. Recently, they came out with a number that said 4.2% of borrowers had an error.
Right, so they said, we did this whole review, and then this got huge headlines. Oh, don't worry, it's only 4.2% of the people have an error.
But just last week, the government has an auditor. It's called the Government Accountability Office, and they basically said that the OCC did not come up with a systemic methodology. They didn't tell each bank how to figure out where there were errors. They didn't have a series of consistent categories, and they basically found out that there was no way that you could have figured out one consistent error rate across all of the banks because there was no consistent methodology. It was like reverse engineered to make the banks look as good as possible.
How surprising is this to you, Eliot?
Look, not at all. 2 points. First, the amount of money involved in the totality of the settlement, and this is why Faith only gets $500, is less than the Treasury Department gave to Goldman Sachs to cover Goldman's exposure to AIG, which is over $12 billion. Nobody said anything. Goldman just got a check for $12 billion. All the mass and wrongful foreclosures in the country, only about 2/3 of that. So the amount of money is insanely low, too. Let's put the OCC in historical context. It is the paradigm of a broken, fraudulent regulatory body. It has been in the back pocket of the banks historically. 3 chapters to this. It's tragedy. 1, pre-crash. In 2003, I and all the other AGs went to court to try to open up the subprime scandal. The OCC came in on the side of the banks to stop us. We had to litigate all the way to the Supreme Court.
Against the regulator.
Against the OCC, they were covering for the banks. Chapter 2, the OCC opposed mortgage write-downs, the sort that would have benefited Faith, that would have saved the economy. The OCC said, no, we're here to protect the banks, not the entirety of our economy. Right. Chapter 3, what Alexis just described, they're absolutely grotesque failure to do an appropriate review. So the OCC should be eliminated. Wipe it off the board.
It's just a whitewash. When they said the 4.2% error rate, they were lying. It was an unabashed lie.
All right. Well, so Morris Morgan, who's from the OCC, says to the American Banker, do I think there were a significant number of people who were foreclosed on where the banks did not have legal right to foreclose on them? At this point in time, I don't think that was a significant number. I guess my question to you, Faith, is do you feel that there is anyone who has your interests at heart as one of the people who are represented on the spreadsheet, as one of the statistics? Is there anyone in Washington you feel has your interest in heart who is looking out for you?
Yes and no. Oh, Tom Curry, he inherited this problem, just like President Obama inherited this problem. So he only can do what he can do. He unplugged it, and to me, as a homeowner that was a victim, I'm finally going to get something. My problem is $3.6 billion that will all go to all of us that were victims, and the independent auditors are getting $2 billion. Right. I really have a problem with that. They're getting more than half.
Let me explain that. These are the consultants who were hired to conduct this big review. They're walking away with $2 billion in fees for conducting it. The sum total amount of cash that is going to the people that were wrongly foreclosed on is $3.6 billion.
Hired by the services, we should point out.
Yes, hired by the banks themselves.
Not even hired as independent, the word independent, but not really independent.
So just really quickly, so say you're a borrower who's going to get $500. There was a consultant hired by a bank who was paid $250 per hour to review your file, and they walked away with $10,000 to look at your story of tragedy, and they now get $500 to the consultant's $10,000.
Quickly, and finally, Elliot, why do the banks skate away with paying money and then going off to do it again? What has to change in that?
We heard it from Eric Holder a couple weeks ago. We can't possibly bring a case against the banks because it would do bad things to the economy. A flawed premise that too big to fail has become too big to prosecute, too big to indict, too big even to exact a meaningful penalty. They walk away without even admitting wrongdoing. The whole paradigm of prosecution has to change.
Yeah, and no amount of writing checks is going to change
Money
that.
Doesn't do it.
Former Governor Eliot Spitzer, Alexis Goldstein, and in Sacramento, Faith Bautista. Thank you. All right, what I'm about to say was viewed as an impossible pipe dream for months. And now, listen to this, it looks like a Senate vote on gun legislation will happen on Thursday, and a filibuster threat appears to be on the ropes. Why it happened and who is responsible and how it can still fall apart, next.